Hey, good evening, everyone. My name is Amanda. I'm the Events and Marketing Director for Bookworks, your 35-year-old independent bookstore in the North Valley of Albuquerque. Thank you so much for joining us for another virtual event tonight. I think this is number 55 for me from during the pandemic from my illustrious home office here. We're very pleased to have so many friends of poetry here with us tonight, to see lots of familiar names and some faces. We're happy to have Ray Gonzalez with us to celebrate his new book, FEEL PUMA, which just came out from the University of New Mexico Press. Ray is coming at us from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and he's going to be speaking to Valerie Martinez this evening, the Director of History and Literary Arts at the National Hispanic Cultural Center. I'll let you two take it away. I'll do some chatting with you. I can send you the link for looking at and purchasing Ray's new book from Bookworks. And if you attendees have a question during the event, feel free to type that into the chat. We will address those toward the end. Ray, welcome. Valerie, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Amanda, and thank you, Ray, for being here. And as Amanda said, I'm Valerie Martinez, Director of History and Literary Arts at the National Hispanic Cultural Center. And I'm so happy to be here with Bookworks and UNM Press, who are our programming partners, not only for a series of book readings this fall, but with other programs that we present. And so I love working with them. And when we cooked up this idea of book readings featuring books from the UNM Press Fall Catalog, they were all in, and that just made me really happy. At the Hispanic Cultural Center, we're dedicated to the preservation, promotion, and advancement of Hispanic arts, culture, and humanities. And this book series and this book event help us do that, as well as with the support of our partners. So I'm so glad that you're all here. I'm so glad that Ray's here, whose work that I've read and loved for many, many years. But before we move on to Ray, I want to introduce Bryce Emily from UNM Press and have him say a little bit about the press. Bryce?
All right, thanks, Val. Thanks to everybody for showing up for this, and Ray, thanks for taking the time to read for us.
Sure.
It's probably the best way to get you to read in Albuquerque. But so we really appreciate having relationships with cultural organizations like the National Hispanic Cultural Center here in Albuquerque, and are always looking for more partnerships like that to bring authors like Ray out to and we wanted to also draw your attention to the next one of these partnered readings that we will have with the National Hispanic Cultural Center. Will be with Rebecca Bloom Martinez and Mary Jean Haberman Lopez. They'll be talking about their very new book, The Shoulders We Stand On, A History of Bilingual Education in New Mexico. And that'll be on November 18th at 6 p.m. So if you or any other educators or people interested in education in New Mexico, please share and show up for that. But and continue to support Bookworks, either by buying this book there or any other books. And from what I understand, this would be the time to buy your books at Bookworks for the holiday season. So I hope you all do that and continue to support our independent bookstores and our cultural organizations that do so much for our community here, like the NHCC. So thanks, Val.
Thanks, Bryce. So this is the way this is going to unfold tonight. I'm going to introduce Ray formally, and then he'll read a little bit, we'll chat, he'll read a little bit more and we'll chat, we'll check the time and see where we are, maybe a little more reading, and then we'll open up the chat to Q&A. Amanda will help us with that. So that we can hear from you and you can ask your questions directly to Ray. So I'm going to introduce Ray formally. So I'm going to read this because I don't want to mess that up, and because you're about to hear from somebody who's just has considerable works, considerable books, and lots of awards. So I'm going to read this. Ray Gonzalez is the author of numerous books of poetry, including 6 from BOA Editions: The Heart of Arrivals, which won the Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Book Award. Cabato Centora, the 2000 Minnesota Book Award finalist. The Hawk Temple at Tierra Grande, 2003 Minnesota Book Award. Consideration of the Guitar, New and Selected Poems, 2005. Cool Auditor, Prose Poems, 2009. And Beautiful Wall, 2016 Minnesota Book Award. The University of Arizona Press published 8 books, including Turtle Pictures, which won the 2001 Minnesota Book Award. His poems have appeared in the 1999, 2000, 2003, and 2014 editions of the Best American Poetry. He is the author of 3 collections of essays, including The Underground Heart, A Return to a Hidden Landscape, and that won the 2003 Carr P. Collins Texas Institute of Letters Award for Best Books of Nonfiction. He received a 2002 Latino Heritage Award in Literature. He's the editor of 12 anthologies, most recently Sudden Fiction Latino, short stories from the US and Latin America. He received a 2017 Witter-Binner Fellowship from the Library of Congress, a 2015 Continta Lifetime Achievement Award in Latino Literature, and a 2002 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Southwest Border Regional Library Association. So Ray, we're so honored to have you. And if you just want to start with opening words or want to start with the reading, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. Well, thank you all for coming this evening, and I want to thank Amanda and Valerie for their hard work. I used to be a literary organizer when I lived in Denver and also worked in a bookstore. So I know what that's like. So thank you for your support, and I want to thank the sponsors, including the bookstore. And of course, the University of New Mexico Press. They have a wonderful staff, and they did a beautiful job on the book. Just amazing work that they do. And it's good to see an old friend from Minneapolis, Jules. And then a current student, Brandon, and a former student, Sue. And they're all writers, they're all poets. So it's nice to have a group of fellow writers here. So thanks again. I'll begin by, the new book is called FEEL PUMA. And of course, people ask me, what kind of a weird title is that? What does that mean? And the second poem talks about that. But I'll begin with kind of like an introductory poem, which is the short little prose piece at the front of the book. And it's called Las Ramas, which means the roots. I began to listen inside the stanza of a poem and heard individual sounds as Gripa or Arlo or R calling to each other. Agripa is a creature that cries out, and Arlo a floating wing. I don't know what an R might be, though it tunes itself. What kind of union did these sounds proclaim? Hearing these cries put me on the other side of the poem, where growth resides. I moved among forceful sounds in my first attempt at the poem. What would happen if Agrippa left the poet behind? Decisions about the language would be based on the after darkness following the encounter. Radiant light between words fertilizes syllables around it. For length, I chose 8 lines, which permit a speaker to make his move. It was the sound of my open mouth, la rama sticking out, the word related to a Spanish word for root. The notes that fell off las ramas allowed the shadows in the poem to encircle the throat of the speaker, as in roots spreading around a tree trunk. The situation changing constantly because the more you add sound to the poem, new words appear on their own, thus entering the text as the speaker pulls las ramas out of his chest before finishing the poem. This next poem is the title poem, FEEL PUMA, and the line that I borrowed for the title of the book is by Cesar Vallejo, the great Peruvian poet, as important as Federico Garcia Lorca and Pablo Neruda. And the line from a Vallejo poem says, I want to write, but I feel Puma, which I guess is similar to Lorca's Duende, that powerful creative force that just runs through your body as you're working on poems. Feel Puma. Feel Puma when the black animal draws near, its shadow growing in the written snow, the blossom opening in rivers and flooded dams, where mountain ice freezes the stalking tongue. Feel Puma, the claws of fate. Feel Puma when the black creature fills the arms and legs with instinct for the prey. Plays stone, plays anvil, plays God. Blasts roads in a ruined country. The hunter entangled in the trees, unable to write what he saw. Feel Puma when the black figure disappears, puts faith in scorpions and birds, a white landscape marking magic with plants and roots from the tree of quenching silence, the notes of the unborn. I'm used to reading standing up, so it's hard to flip through these sitting down. But I guess that's part of the new reality. We'll talk later about, I guess, some of the characteristics of some of these poems compared to some earlier poems that I've written. But no matter how different they are, one thing that always takes place and stays in all my poems are issues about family. My father recently died back in early June. You know, I've been writing poems about him for decades and decades. And I think this book, the early proofs came out around the same time. So it was interesting to go back and look at this poem along with finding out about his death. The Burning Father. The burning father discovers his two sons are on fire, one in flames, the other hidden in smoke like a train running wildly across the hazy earth. The burning father tries to put out the fires, but his sons want their charred remains to start new families. Black smeared on their faces after their father dies. His resurrection angering his sons because he gave them no time. The returning father reminding them their mother has been gone for years and she never burned, simply held out her hands and gently cupped the falling ashes to her chest. One more poem and then we can have a discussion. And along with always writing about family and of course the issues that are going on as we speak, especially about immigration and all the tragedy of what's going on the border with the incarceration camps. Another issue that I write about, actually something that I saw my whole life growing up in El Paso, and I always assumed it was natural, was the way people were always being treated as they crossed the border. 7 fires. 7 fires burn on the US-Mexican border. Their flame signaling that something has died. Each fire starts at a different isolated spot in the desert each night. No one knows who lights them since they burn hundreds of miles apart. 7 fires marking journeys that crossed and treks that ended on the other side of the line. 7 fires smoke along the Rio Grande, their glow attracting no one, no movement at the wire, no camps to allow water in a resting spot. 7 suns radiating over what took place, how often it happened, and why few managed to cross the mountains and reach the towns where other fires are doused each evening. 7 fires glow eternally to design a light, black smoke easing down to cover the graves. Though embers lead to the path of survival, beyond the heat of the ground, faces catching a spark as they move north. 7 fires blessing the ones who keep reigniting the ground.
Thanks for that, Ray.
Sure.
So I have a lot of questions. We'll never get through them, but there's 2 things that you said just now that have struck me. One is about your father, because this poem, especially later on in the book, has these homages to male poets, or at least, you know, they seem to be, and the one that you just read has this very powerful sort of sense of the male energy, it seems to me. So that's one thing. And the second is these poems in this book are really so grounded in place. You're in Minneapolis. And so I wonder if you think you've written about where you are as much as you write about where you're from, and how you think about place in terms of in terms of your own work.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it depends on the topic of the poem that I'm working on. I certainly have written more about where I came from. I can never let go of that I think it's the landscape of the Southwest, that always keeps me there, plus family issues that seem to, go by forever and never really get resolved, even after a father has passed away. I've written a number of poems about Minnesota, set in Minnesota, because I've been here long enough. But those are a different tone, more of a, I guess, a reflection on what's going on now, the more present point of view. And certainly the winter took a while to get used to the Minnesota winters, even though I had taught in Chicago for 3 years before I came to Minnesota. And I thought that was cold. Well, it was nothing compared to Minnesota. So yeah, I have a good number of Minnesota poems by now, and maybe make one manuscript out of those at some point.
Yeah, and can you talk about, do you think having lost your father, that's an epic Freudian, right, and Jungian thing, has that been part of this book, that sort of loss, or is that part of a book that's coming?
Probably a book that's coming. And like I said earlier, I wrote a lot of poems about him over the years. So these happen to be included, by coincidence. But some of the things that happened the last few years are all gathered in your poems that'll, come out down the road. So it's a long story. I won't get into all the details, but yeah, that's a whole work in itself down the road.
Yeah, earlier in the book, you do write really about migration or migrants, right? There's a lot of poems very powerfully sort of evoking images of the river and crossings and things like that. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of current events and how they enter the poems, if it's conscious, if it's not conscious, how that works for you.
Well, I've always written about the Rio Grande River because it was right there near my home, just a couple of miles from several neighborhoods where I last lived before I left West Texas for good. And some of the writers that really influenced me have also, over the decades, written about the river and the landscapes in the Southwest, and several important environmental writers that use the river as kind of like a central point to write about not only its natural history, but some of the, I guess, cultural movements that happened there over time that really helped to shape what's happening today, both good and bad, with the immigration issues, like I said, but also a lot of the wonderful, magical things that you find in the Southwest, art and culture and history and so forth. So I've never been able to get away from that river. And what I did in this book, the longest poem, well, one of two long poems in the book, deals a lot with the history of the river and some of the native people and how they used the river and how they created symbols to represent their closeness to the river. And the other long poem, I've done a lot of research on the Apaches of southern Arizona and western New Mexico, because my mother grew up in Arizona. So I've been doing a lot of research on that, and I wrote a long poem about Geronimo, and that has a lot to do with the river as well. I guess the river is a central metaphor, but also a natural place where it seems like all this history over centuries kind of revolves around the natural landscape. It's not around a town or a city or a railroad or whatever like that, but it's the natural waters that flow north and south. And of course, now it's the central area where a lot of the immigration conflict is going on, and the river is right there, just down the street from where all these incarcerations are taking place.
Thanks. How about reading a few more poems?
Sure. One of my biggest joys as a writer, and of course as a friend who's known him for a long time, was when Juan Felipe Herrera became the poet laureate. Known Juan for over 30 years, and we shared a lot of good times over the years when we were nobody, trying to make it as writers, as poets, and we would print our own little chapbooks and little pamphlets and broadsides. And so it was great when that happened. He really deserved it, because He's only a few years older than I am, but he's one of my, I guess, one of my teachers in a very informal way, and taught me a lot about the ability to sustain a poetic life, which I think is one of the hardest things to do in this country, where artists in many ways are always put at the bottom of the pecking order. So Juan taught me a lot about being a poet. So the book includes a poem for Juan. Town of Frijoles, for Juan Felipe Herrera. In the town of Frijoles, men eat their meals without washing their hands, wanting to bless their mother's food with soil from the fields. In the town of Frijoles, boys beat on hollow pots, the last wiping of their sides with a piece of tortilla, as holy a moment as taking the wafer in church. In the town of Frijoles, women undress to keep their babies warm. Stories whispered into bald heads revealed as poems decades later, when it is still early. In the town of Frijoles, old men cry for their fathers and mothers. Tombstone ranches dotting the night moon, where the pinto aromas extend beyond the bowl of the sun. One thing I hadn't decided whether I would read the Geronimo poem or not, and maybe I'll read it and skip some of the others I had planned. It's tying in with a lot of things we were talking about. I think it's in 7 sections and they're not that long. Again, based on research on the Apaches, who of course lived in southern Arizona, western New Mexico. El Paso in the early 19th century, actually the late 18th century when it was first created, started out as a little fort on the river, and it was constantly being attacked by Apaches. Geronimo comes from the word Goyale, the one who yawns. And of course, Geronimo, along with Cochise, were probably the 2 most famous Apache chiefs in history. And one of the biggest, longest wars between the US and other people took place between the Apaches and the US cavalry, and it went on for a long time. So there's a lot of information here to take. Another reason to take in, another reason to read it, I think, represents just about everything that I've ever written about in different ways. 1851, the 400 Mexican soldiers rode out of the canyon into the sun, their horses trampling Apache women and children as they ran, killing Geronimo's wife, his mother, and his 3 children. The Chiricahua vowing hatred for all Mexicans from that day on, killing dozens over the years and escaping every time. That day, the 22-year-old warrior was caught by surprise as his men traded in town, the Mexicans wiping out the camp. Geronimo and his warriors escaping to the river where the light over the water grew into flames he could never put out. Leaning against the rocks high above the canyon, Geronimo bleeds, the leg wound covered with pieces of cactus torn to heal it with green flesh. The desert sun burning the Apache chief so he can climb to the top of the cliff and get away. Geronimo drips blood in the sand and it turns as dark as his face that laughs at the sky. The sun blinded him again as he reaches the top, where he sliced open a huge rattler the last time he killed several Mexican soldiers. A long strip of snakeskin he hid in the rocks, stopping the bleeding as Geronimo sits in the opening to the snake den, waiting with his leg wrapped in diamondback light. Geronimo springs through the rocks into the dark and narrow canyon. Mexican soldiers spellbound as they spot him darting straight up the walls with no footholds. The Apache ascending from precipice to cliff as if lifted by the sun, turning to shoot one soldier off his horse, Geronimo carrying a rattlesnake in his mouth as he vanishes, the Mexicans below whispering, then louder, "San Geronimo." The calling of his name rises months later after he ambushes 5 Mexicans with a knife, killing 4 of them as one of his men helped him with a 5th. Surviving soldiers running for their lives and shouting, San Geronimo, as he keeps flying into the rocks, the young chief carrying a thick Gila monster reptile in his mouth. All creatures have the power of speech, the voice whispers over the fire. The sleeping Geronimo awake in his heart, 4 of his warriors dead, 8 captive Mexican soldiers fried in 2 bonfires. The Apaches gifted in capturing the lost dream of their fathers. Geronimo walking in a field of scalps. Apache Pass crowded with US cavalry. The chief dreaming of returning the scalps to the dead and walking in peace. Geronimo sees the eye of the dragon that fought the eagles to rule the desert. Its eye, the smooth stone high up on a cliff he climbs in his sleep. In origin myth, he relives each time the soldiers arrive. Because Geronimo kills the dragon as a boy, 4 arrows piercing its scales into the heart, 4 mountains rising in a rare desert rain. Geronimo waking in time to bow on the earth and take a drink. 1873, Casas Grandes Massacre. Geronimo kneels around the campfire, 11 warriors with him, bloody and tired, breathing hard after the close escape. Another band of them dead half a mile away. That group tricked with mezcal the Mexicans gave them after the false peace treaty. Drunk Apaches killed by the dozens. Geronimo's men obeying him and refusing the bottles of boiling liquid. The worms alive inside the flasks. The mountain lion trapped and killed inside the largest bottle. His men dropped before they escaped the fusillade. The bullets tearing off the rocks. A cave nearby pulling Geronimo in. A hot desert wind shrieking out of nowhere as warriors follow him in. The cave trapping them with no way out. Mexican soldiers waiting outside, the chief appearing high above them out of nowhere. Holding large scorpions, 1 in each palm, the crevice swallowing his 11 men. The narrow cut in the mountain still named Geronimo's Cave today, though no one can find it because they claim it is right there. He kneels in the sand to study the bird Usen, his god, etched into the black rock. Yellow wings commanding the view on the mountain that overlooks everything. Geronimo's flat hands pressing on the animal drawn on the boulder to announce the coming of the Spanish horses. A mask carving to the rough surface above Geronimo's head, the face looking down at the kneeling leader to pass judgment on what he has done. 4 fading lizards descending below the mask to leap onto the Apache shoulders, the reptiles carved long ago before the whites came. He stands with the creatures circling his head, Geronimo dizzy among the signs that cover the rocks with what happened and what can no longer be, because there is a painted cave behind the rocks Geronimo cannot enter. 1886, excuse me. 1886, Skeleton Canyon in Arizona. After decades of fighting Mexican and American soldiers, Geronimo surrenders to the US cavalry. Thousands of Apache dead and dancing in the rocks, cutting themselves with thorns from barrel cactus, weaving formations in the Arizona desert to count a century of genocide. The saguaro streaming great white owls out of their thick and tall arms. The forest of thorns pouring owls until the moment Geronimo's hands are tied by a US soldier. The few survivors led away, the Apache a prisoner for 23 years in confinement. His last deathbed words in 1909 at Fort Sill, Oklahoma: "I never should have surrendered. I should have fought as the last man." 1918, his stolen skull. Members of Yale's Skull and Bones Secret Society desecrated Geronimo's grave at Fort Sill. Prescott Bush, one of the robbers, a relative of 2 US presidents, taking the skull when he was in the Army, as well as some bones in Geronimo's silver bridle. The theft is in the Society's 1918 ledger, though it is denied to this day. Geronimo flying across the canyons, boulders falling on rattlesnake circles below, reptiles flying into the fire. The one who yawns, gripping his forehead in his hands, the lone cry echoing across one canyon as he takes his knife and slices a saguaro to wash himself and paint his hands on the rocks in blood. That was hard to read. First time I've ever read that. And of course, as you can see, very different than the other poems. You really have to slow down and focus on the history and what am I going to do with that and how am I going to write it so flying lizards and snakes, fit into the poem. So yeah, I worked on that for a very long time.
Yeah, that's one thing I was going to ask you about, right? So it's almost like a work of history, that poem, and yet, right, it's sort of, it almost each section sort of then moves or rises to a different place, right? We have these reptiles and scorpions and the forest of thorns, and that those get interwoven in the poem in a way that makes it, for me, poetry, because it could just be about the dates and what happened, right? But the poem moves around all those different landscapes. I don't even know if I want to call it a mythic landscape with all the creatures, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you see that poem in terms of these different sort of ways of using language, different kinds of images that sort of interweave history and, I don't know, would you call it myth, or what would you call it?
Yeah, I think it's a certain kind of myth, and that's a combination of the past, the present imagination of the poet. And I've written a lot of poems where I use different famous figures, whether they're musicians or writers or politicians or historical figures. I've always enjoyed doing that. One of my side projects that's taken years, and it's finished, but now it needs to be revised. And it's reached 250 pages of nothing but poems and short prose poems and essays about famous figures like that, that I just enjoy, with my language, poetic language, playing around with. But beyond that, playing and enjoying poetry on a different level and the more personal kind of poetry that I usually write, I think that myth allows you to recreate perhaps things that didn't happen, but at the same time, as you recreate history, I think you're pushing the truth and the myths forward into the present time, and you're giving your own interpretation, as a writer, as a poet. And I discovered doing that years and years ago. A friend of mine used to write a lot of poems about other people, other figures like that. And I really discovered that enjoyment of doing that because it stretches my imagination. And after I write a number of poems like that, I feel kind of like able to move forward into my more personal poems, and back we go into poems about the father or my hometown or whatever it may be. But that myth in the other poems, I think, really teaches me how to, I guess, own my own language as I go into the present moment of a current poem that deals with the present.
That's interesting, because I was talking about place, but it seems like what you're doing is moving through time, right? In terms of history, you have these dates, but when it rises to myth, it's almost timeless. And when you talk about your present life, it's almost the present. And so maybe it's not place, maybe it's moving through time, or maybe moving through time and space. And one thing, everybody, that I was saying to Ray before this is one of the things that I love about your work, as much as I like the historical references, is I love the way that you use poetic languages. And I often say that for me, I love the language of indirection. When I love poetry, I like the language of direction when we want to hit it right on the head, so to speak, and almost literal. But I simply love poetry more when it's not so direct. And in that poem, for me, the mythic, or the appearance of the scorpions and the reptiles, is where it rises to that language of indirection. I don't know if that makes any sense to you. I mentioned that before we started, but I wonder if you could talk about how you talk about the language of poetry when you're teaching, or how you think about it yourself.
I think one thing that these poems about other people taught me is that one poem can contain more than one voice. It isn't just the lone voice of the creator or the first person I that's writing a very personal poem. I think in working on those poems, you take the historical facts, that you do different things with them that have not been done before, through the poem, and different voices start to appear. I don't think I ever really heard any of Geronimo's voices. I don't mean it that way. I mean the voice of the poet sitting in front of the computer writing a poem. And I can hear myself writing and speaking and maybe repeating a couple of lines I wasn't sure about, and over a period of time realized that there are a number of voices within one poem, and those voices create that indirection or that surreal language that lets you move through the poem in many different ways. So I think some of my most literal poems are simply those first person I. They're very literal and very direct. There isn't much mythical imagination there. And if I went back and rewrote some of those poems, if I wrote a poem about my father and had it for a long time and thinking, well, after he died, I'm going to go in there and revise it and change some things. I could do that, but I know I would hear different poetic voices telling me how to shape the lines, move the lines, which words I'm going to use, which ones I'm going to take out. And that creates kind of like this movement of indirection in the language. You get away from the literal ABC 1, 2, 3 chronology, that the most basic poem contains. And so I think that's also a challenge to many poets. Not that poets have to make their poems more complex, but how do you listen to those voices that are pushing you into the center of one poem? Those voices are not telling you to write 17 poems. They're telling you to write this one poem that has many dimensions and many possibilities. And I think once you sit down and start doing that, that's when a new poem starts to come out and new drafts come out and you go back and revise. And as you revise, there's that indirection again and something else happens and maybe that leads you to another poem where you do away completely with the first draft and some other thing is created.
Yeah, and I think in some ways it's allowing all those voices in, right? It's not censoring them or compartmentalizing them as a poet and saying, well, this belongs over here and this belongs over here, because one of the things poetry does beautifully is allows all of that in, the complexity, the layering, and trusting that maybe a lot of those voices belong in one poem. It's okay. And I think that when I've taught, I've really tried to impress that upon students too, is, that left brain or the compartmentalizing brain, we use that all the time. And so poetry can be a place for letting everything kind of come in and, weeding out. Don't be so, logical about weeding things out. And if you'd done that in the Geronimo poem, maybe you would have created two different poems or they wouldn't even be poems. I'm not sure what it would be.
Right. And another thing with that kind of poem, and it also took me a while after writing a number of them. And after a couple of students asked me, is everything real in a poem? Does the poem always have to tell the truth? Does the poem always have to stick to fact? Well, in these imaginary poems about different famous figures, a good portion of them is me taking the metaphors, taking the facts, and basically creating a fiction out of them in order to create that movement and in order to make a larger point, to try to reach a larger truth. And so my answer would be that that kind of poetry can have fiction and imaginary things happening, and not every poem is going to be 100% realistic and factual. And that's also part of creating the myth. As the poet, you have that freedom to do that indirection and to take those words and do something with them, trying to get to that larger truth. And of course, the challenge for any poet is to reach that truth. And I don't know if poets will ever do that. I think that's why we keep writing, because there's something that's never quite there, and we have to go after it.
True. So would you like to read a couple more poems and then we'll open up to chatting with everyone?
Sure. Speaking of famous figures, I think the last section in the book has more of those poems than anybody else, in any other section with anybody else. The poet that really, well, it was my mentor, Robert Burlingame, who taught at the University of Texas in El Paso. He was a wonderful poet. He died about 10 years ago. He opened my eyes to poetry when I hated poetry. I was a journalism major in school, wanted nothing to do with poetry. One day he puts up the poem Traveling Through the Dark by William Stafford on the board, and they're discussing it, and I'm hiding in the back of the class. And then I look up at the board, look down at the anthology, hoping he doesn't call on me. And there's a couple of lines from a stanza that he quotes, and I look up, and instantly it hit me that I knew what poetry was for the first time in my life. And I've written an essay about that. I mean, it was an overwhelming experience. But the poet is William Stafford, so I always, off and on, like to visit with William Stafford. I read his poems and write about him. On William Stafford's 100th birthday, January 17th, 2014. What survives is a voice in the wilderness where few go to listen to the silence. Imagine they mark the highway out of there with light, a thought, and a set of paws in the snow. The secret holds the forest in hand, stretching across the desert where the rescued hide in sadness. What is hidden is revealed by the man who insists on leaving at dawn before God misses the morning star. Imagine a voice calling, "You are home." Imagine the snow never falling on the dead, the gravestones left to the imagination that heard the owl call, saw the boy at last and found the wind. When the boy grew into a man and knelt down one day, it wasn't to pray, to get closer to the earth. The last poem is actually the last poem in the book. And I think this one is a good one to close with because it does remind me now of what we were saying about indirect. And in this case, indirect language. In this case, I take some historical facts and I turn them around completely and do a few different things. It's called If by Chance the Child Prodigy. The northern stars demand that the southern stars stay home. Fate says the planet should not be written about unless the child prodigy is nearby, resurrected in a thought found in a handwritten note dropped on the school playground. The message is a guide to burial sites and the color of the skulls there. The northern stars draw closer while the galaxy becomes a cooking pan used by a woman in a rotting cabin on the Texas plains in 1832. The southern stars realign the black hole as the universe intended, a dark star in the root of musical things. Pursued past Venus and Pluto, the doomed herd goes over the top at the Great Buffalo Jump in Wyoming. If by chance the child prodigy slices a meteor with her mind, it will take place over and over again. Men will descend stone steps to take a look. Star charts will be abolished, and radioactive gardens shall replace them. The northern hand grasps the southern palm, the smell between them floating east into the expected canyons. The western reaches do not shake hands because of the conquering civilization and its torn weapons, its worn boots, the empire finally at rest. If by chance the child prodigy traces a blood canal in her spinal cord, the tribe will change, devastation thriving in star silence. Then your ideas will be perceived and their fury will raise the casualties. The nation shall pull out of the country where the coffins have thrived. Eastern constellations will outnumber Western nebulas, the course of the starships plotted 8,000 years ago. Children in dusty schoolrooms, textbooks turning yellow on shelves against the back walls. Believers offering websites for tracking the northern and southern stars. If by chance the child prodigy survives the cluster bombs, let her walk again, because bloody feet can cross the desert without having to rename the earth.